Czechast, a podcast in English about Czech and Moravian society, history, culture and economy.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Czechast, the podcast in English where we dive into all things Czech. I'm Vít Pohanka, your host, and throughout this year we've explored some fascinating phenomena, from the Czech love affair with mushroom picking to why this country is called Czechia. But at the heart of Czechast are stories of people and their identities that are often layered and shaped by the unique currents of Czech history. As I record this episode, and as 2024 comes to a close, I thought it fitting to bring you the story of someone whose life reflects the incredible transformation of Czechoslovakia and later Czechia from a communist state to a democracy, a member of the European Union and NATO. That person is Martin Palouš, philosopher, dissident, diplomat and academic. You know, I like to think of the history of nations and people as a never-ending chain of events shaped by both intention and random chance. Martin Palouš's story is a very rich source of such fascinating and unexpected moments, like, for example, when he was the spokesperson of Charter 77 in the 1980s and he met the future US Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, for the first time.
We were invited by political, maybe DCM of US Embassy, to a breakfast with Senator Larry Pressler, conservative Republican from, I think, South Dakota or some place like that. And I was the only one who managed to attend that meeting because both Jan Stern and Anna Shabatova were locked at their homes. Secret service or police officers didn't allow them to go there. So I was sitting in that apartment, and Larry Pressler decided that he had to demonstrate his commitment, so just go to see them over there. So everybody disappeared. I stayed there with one lady. It was Madeleine Albright, and she was there representing NDI, National Democratic Institute. So we started to talk, we were talking, and after 2 hours we just wanted to leave because there was no more information.
I spoke with him just before Christmas in his cozy apartment in Újezd beneath the shadow of Petřín Hill in Prague. We were scheduled to talk for about 45 minutes, but I ended up filling my recorder with almost double that time as Martin shared his memories. To ensure you get a full picture, I decided to divide the interview into two parts. I've kept the edits minimal and added some basic information about the people and events Martin mentions for listeners who might not be closely familiar with the Czech dissent scene of the 1970s and 80s or the political landscape of that era. I'm Vít Pohanka, your host, and before we dive in, take a moment to settle in, whether you're out for a walk, jogging through the park, or relaxing at home with your favorite drink. Find your pace, get comfortable, and let's begin.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.
I was born in 1950, so my life experience is the second half of the 20th century, and then transition and transformation from what we used to be in the past to what we are now in the end of the first quarter of the 21st century. My father was born in a family of, I would say, not really religious people, but devoted believers in the Masaryk's ideas. My grandfather was a journalist. Actually, it was very interesting that at home they used to speak German because he was born in České Budějovice, and so then he was discovering in his own way the life of new Czechoslovak society after 1918. So I could go back to his history, but might not be interesting in this context.
In other words, you were born to a Prague family, but family that
Prague
came
family,
from
but my mother was, I would say, a traditional devoted Catholic family. So it was an interesting combination of these two influences. When I was born, obviously the communist regime was already in full swing of its operation. So just to state the facts, my uncle, one of the brothers of my mother, was in jail. So I saw him for the first time in 1960 when the amnesty in connection with Czechoslovakian, I would say, advancement to socialism was exactly it was in 1960. They added the word socialist into the name of the state, and they released a lot of prisoners under this occasion. Why? But they did. So I saw certain people for the first time. Later, best friend of my father, Jaroslav Kohout, Social Democrat, who also spent more than 10 years in jail. I mentioned my grandfather's brother, Gustav. He was Czech industrialist. So he was one of these rather powerful players before the war, and then he ended up in jail too. And they just took everything from him. So we had this type of family tradition. So when I was discovering the world in 1950 plus as a small toddler, I had to absorb all these changes, the situation. On the one hand, I just can tell you, when my great uncle, which means brother of my grandfather, was released from jail, he moved to our apartment and lived with us. We were living in Trojanova 18, which means around Karlovo náměstí. And he was used to use bathroom for some time, so out of sudden, it was for us a problem that the bathroom was locked and
crowded.
Yeah, exactly. But then he moved to some other place, so we were exposed to his story. He was a very gentlemanly person, but with this experience. So I have already mentioned the other side, my uncle and another uncle and grandfather who was an industrialist. He was in construction business, and they took everything from him except his depths, because if you were developer, you had to
have some
make some loans. So loans were left with him. So he had to, and his successors, pay for it for years and ages. So we were living in this world of the 1950s. In this situation, I also was very fortunate because my father was one of the very avid and active students of Jan Patočka at Charles University.
Famous philosopher.
Philosopher, and he was fired from Charles University and he was employed in the Comenius Institute, Masaryk Institute. It doesn't matter, but they had meetings in our apartment. Circle of Patočka's students. I think that if we want to think about private universities, I then had an opportunity to meet myself much later. So some sort of prehistory of that.
So this was like a
can take exactly goes back to 1950s. I had no idea what these people were talking about, but I was exposed to this influence. We were serving them some snacks, and young Jiří Němec was there, by the way, with Dana and Láďa Hejdánek and Ivan Vyskočil.
All these
people that started to play more and visible, active role in the golden 60s.
All the names mentioned, Jan Patočka, Jiří and Dana Němec, or Němcovi, Ladislav Hejdánek, represent the leading figures of Czech philosophy, political thought and theology in the second half of the 20th century. Martin Palouš was not only fortunate to meet them as a young boy, but also lived through the transformative 1960s as a teenager.
So for me, the first thing I can remember is 1960s. Golden 60s, not only that we could discover through tape recorders, Beatles and Rolling Stones, but it was a time of Prague, new wave, Václav Havel, Forman, and I can go on and on with that. And so I was exposed to intellectual discussions concerning the 1960s when I was already in transition from being a toddler, small boy, and teenager. So for me, my first, I would say, active crossroads was obviously 1968. Because it was the culmination of certain trends, and then at the end, abrupt end of the hopes because of geopolitical situation, Brezhnev doctrine and invasion to Czechoslovakia.
So you would have been like 18, right, in 1968?
I was born in October 1950, so I was 17 and a half, so I finished my secondary education in střední všeobecně vzdělávací škola, some sort of gymnasium. In the spring of that year, I still spent summer in a summer camp in England because it was a time of our freedom. I had no idea what third way or these reform communist ideas were all about, but we experiencing freedom. Out of sudden, it was a very moving and dynamic moment.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm just curious, and I know that this is perhaps not so important, but where did you go for the summer camp in England, and what was it like coming
Well,
to England for
we
the
were
first
picking
time?
strawberries in East England and had a opportunity to communicate with all other young people, different perspectives. Obviously, what was very strong then was Israelis, because it was 67, if you remember what it was all about. So they were coming there with their full of their own enthusiasm. We had our own experience of 68. Summer of 68 was meeting in London. People who were very skeptical what was about to come, because obviously it was this meeting in Černá nad Tisou, and I got back to Prague around August 10 or something, so I experienced this deadly and historical morning of August 21st in Prague. So I had an opportunity to observe all the dynamics.
The Red Army, which just a few short weeks before had gone home, was back. The Czechs and the free world had not anticipated this. But the hammer and sickle had returned to pound and cut the Czechs' hopes of a liberal, self-governing communist way of life.
So, from a front row seat, Martin witnessed how hopes for reforming communism were crushed beneath the tracks of Soviet, Polish, East German, Bulgarian and Hungarian tanks.
Throughout the West, leader after leader spoke for their people in deploring the Russian invasion. Seats of government were rocked by the massive setback in East-West relations. An emergency meeting of the UN Security Council was called, but the damage has already been done.
I started to study at Charles University School of Natural Sciences. We went to this hop-picking brigade and were following what was happening. First demonstrations in Prague, this type of spirit of freedom that was in the Prague streets. And then the trend of the fall of 1968 was very strong for me. By the way, I was in the first year of my studies at Charles University, and I happened to become one of the organizers of this student strike in November of that year that was trying to come up with some sort of reaction of young people to these beginning stages of normalization. By the way, on this occasion, I had the first opportunity to meet face-to-face Václav Havel. It was thanks to Vyskočil, who was his buddy from Činoherní Klub, that gave me contact to him so I could invite him to one of our meetings or assemblies at the School of Natural Sciences at Charles University.
Probably the student strike committees.
Something like that. And but then I discovered very quickly that it was some sort of hopeless struggle, that most of my colleagues, students and professors, started to get themselves coordinated with that new situation. There was this Socialist Union of Youth, and if you planned to be a scientist, you had to take the political situation into consideration.
You have to conform.
Conform. Look, I don't want to be too personal. And so I fully respect all these people who are really focused on their science. And if you do natural science, the relationship between science and social aspects of politics is complicated. But anyways, for me, it was not a way to go forward. Because of my personal relationships, maybe I was in love with one of my student colleagues, I didn't consider for me an option to emigrate. For many people, 68, 69 was a threshold. Should we stay, should we go? Many people went out and I decided to stay, but had to deal with the consequences. And the consequences was step by step that I realized that I was still working very hard on my research and science, but my future as a scientist
wasn't bright.
In jeopardy. It was gone. So I had to find some other ways how to, I would say, be existentially active and felt in my life some direction and meaning. And I discovered two things. First, philosophy. The consolation of philosophy is a long tradition going back to the ancient state, but in our times it was maybe Emanuel Radl and then his devoted disciple Láďa Hejdánek. So I just got associated with all these independent circles of students of philosophy. Patočka was our master, a real teacher, but if you had an opportunity to start communicating with people like that, these alternatives in your life started to grow around yourself. And the second thing, which was very important for me, was my religion. Because of my family background, it sounds like a bizarre, but still in the mid-50s or 56, 57, it was possible to go to catechetic education at school. So I had this type of exposure. So I had the first communio and all these things in 1950s. But then, as all young people, I found myself rather separated from these traditional things. But interestingly enough, 1970, I rediscovered Catholic networks as very interesting network of communication. So I had these two things that helped me to go through the 1970s. I had to go to military service. I was absolvent,
You were the non-commissioned officer.
Exactly. Yeah, I was not the officer because I had a very bad profile. I rejected to sign any statement that I agree with the
invasion of the
presence of the Soviet troops. So I was in a very bizarre situation when I was in the army. But after I returned back, 75, I still was exposed to the question, what should I do?
But let me just stop you here for a second. I mean, you studied natural sciences, but then you went on to study at Faculty of Arts, no? I mean, you did...
Exactly, it was when I was starting
so you completely switched.
I was fortunate that I still was able to enroll myself to study of social sciences and philosophy.
It was still possible then.
It was possible. By the way, it had very absurd consequences. And one of them was that when I was in the armed service, what was in my record was that I could not command anyone, but I was still student at the School of Arts and student of Marxist-Leninist philosophy. So all these colonels and people there believed that I can help them to write their tests because they were studying the same thing in their own way. So
just for the listeners, at that time, if you wanted to study philosophy,
that
was the only way it had to be.
But the interesting thing was that I managed still, before Patočka was retired, 72 I believe it was,
still attend, I suppose, his
lectures.
Exactly,
these were his last lecture seminars at Charles University, but for me transition from this situation to the Patočka's private seminars and lectures. So in that context, I was not in touch directly only with those who I met as a small boy, thanks to my father, but there was a whole group of the next generation of Patočka students. All these people who then were able to save the Patočka's manuscripts after he passed away as a Charter 77 spokesperson in March of 1977, and the tradition going to the archives of Jan Patočka, and all of that is still going on and on. So, going back to this situation, I was a part of that community of people that were trying to find some alternatives. And certainly when Charter 77 came, I'm just now skipping many important parts. I was also part of Plastic People Universe and Trial and the fall of 1976, but I signed Charter 1977 among the first signatories.
Here, quick aside again, the Plastic People of the Universe were a Czech underground rock band formed in the 1968, famous for their defiance of the communist regime. Influenced by Western rock, their avant-garde music and rebellious spirit became symbols of resistance to state censorship. In 1976, several members were arrested and tried for, quote-unquote, disturbing the peace, exposing the regime's intolerance for cultural dissent. Their trial ignited opposition, inspiring Václav Havel and others to draft Charter 77, a landmark human rights initiative that played a key role in the fall of communism in Czechoslovakia. Adding your signature under the document meant that you would be constantly harassed by the communist secret police, the STB, and couldn't get a decent job. Yet Martin Palouš didn't hesitate a second.
If you ask me why I did that, what was my feeling in that moment, I don't want to say that I knew what I was doing. I don't want to say that I was a heroic person, but I didn't find a better alternative for my life than to do that. And then obviously we're making my own experience with first exposures to state security, which was not very pleasant. The fact that I was immediately fired from my job, I had to work as a stoker. But from the first moment, if you decided to do that, you got a very significant compensation for your losses. And the compensation was that you got so many interesting friends, that you immediately was finding yourself in that community. Václav Benda later called it parallel polis, people with different perspectives, different points of view. There was a bunch of former communists fired from the party. I was not one of those. I was something between this Catholicism, intellectual dissent like Patočka, and underground, because this was something what was
your generation.
My generation. And I got together, thanks to Jiří and Dana Němcovi, with this strange and very interesting community that had center in Ječná 7 in their apartment. Then I married one of Dana's and Jiří's daughters, my wife, till today. So I got together with this community of people. In 1977, obviously international contexts are always interesting. Was final act of the Helsinki Conference and Charter 77 document or this statement was trying to link our argument to these international processes. But in 1977, we had no imagination that things can change, that it's,
no hope.
It rather was a recipe how to have a decent life under the given circumstances, no matter what. And obviously time was running step by step. And then in the middle of 1980s, I already discovered that there was a new generation of signatories Charter 77, Vondra, Joachim Topol, Ivan Lamper, Revel Review and all of that. But at the same time, Mikhail Gorbachev got into power in Moscow, so even international context started to change, and all these steps, one after another, were leading us to this miraculous year of 1989. So if you ask me what the basic crossroads in my life, 1968, I already said, was the first one. 1977 was the second one, and then the third one was 1989. I was again fortunate to be able to participate in it from the very beginning as an insider and as an active participant.
You were a spokesperson for Charter 77, 1986, if I remember correctly. What was the most challenging moment? I mean, you mentioned that in a way the community created this kind of parallel world, parallel universe of people, which was probably very nice. But what was the worst moment that you went through?
Well, obviously, I remember very well my Christmas, early days of 1986, because when you are to become a spokesperson for Charter 77, you know that now the attention of all your opponents will be on you, and that it would mean a lot in that sense. But at the same time, you feel some sort of responsibility. Just to remind you what it was all about for me, was that my two other colleagues, Hanna Shabatová and Jan Stern. So Hanna Shabatová from this family of Jaroslav Šabata and Peter Uhl, or this type of worldview, Jan Stern, former communist, with a very interesting personal history, but with his family background. So I was there representing whom? Underground, Christian dissidents. So we always had to find a way how to do this right. Charter 77 didn't have any, I would say, strong procedural rules. But you always had to search consensus so that you are not on your own crazy way, but trying to represent a significant aspect of parallel policy. But at the same time, 1986 was already a year when this opening was on the way, which means that we started to be invited to U.S. Embassy. By the way, I met under very bizarre circumstances. I liked for the first time Madeleine Albright. Mm-hmm. It happened in the following way. We were invited by political, maybe DCM of U.S. Embassy to a breakfast with Senator Larry Pressler, conservative Republican from, I think, South Dakota or some place like that. And I was the only one who managed to attend that meeting because both Jan Stern and Hanna Shabatová were locked at their homes. Secret service or police officers didn't allow them to go there. So sitting in that apartment, and Larry Pressler decided that he had to demonstrate his commitment, so just go to see them over there. So everybody disappeared. I stayed there with one lady. It was Madeleine Albright, and she was there representing NDI, National Democratic Institute. So we started to talk. We were talking, and after 2 hours, we just wanted to leave because there was no more information. We left the apartment, locked the door, went downstairs, and the front door was locked too. So we spent another 2 hours discussing things, sitting there on the steps and waiting for what was to happen.
So whose apartment was it? I mean, who organized the meeting?
It was already used as human dimension of Helsinki process. Right. That U.S. diplomats and politicians have a full right to communicate only with the government and governmental representatives, but these people. Mm-hmm. And we were the people, and so it was
just a technicality. I know that you mentioned the U.S. Embassy, but I was just wondering, was it an apartment of a diplomat? Or
it was always done with certain, I would say, diplomatic sensitivities. This was the private apartment of U.S. diplomats there. Mm-hmm. Then we started to be invited to the residence of U.S. ambassador or DCM, and so we had a couple of very bizarre encounters with officials because they were supposed to be there too. So sometimes when they had to see us, they decided to leave. It was this type of a strange aspect of Helsinki process. First, security process from above, going top down, and then human dimension, humanitarian and human rights issues. And it turned out that when Gorbachev got to power, he started to, I would say, to separate the Soviet policies in these times from Brezhnev doctrine. That was a very different thing. So when we survived all of that, and this miraculous year 1989 came first with this Palach week in Czechoslovakia. I got into trouble on this occasion because I read some text on Václav Square, so I ended up in detention, and I was picked up next day in the morning at home, and okay.
You were detained, yeah.
Yeah, but anyways, it was the beginning of something. It was still our repressive organs were using this type of methods, but they had to see what was happening in Poland, leading to this roundtable discussion. General Jaruzelski was unwilling to talk to his detainees like Anna Michnik and others. And then Hungarian development and what was happening during that year in summer. Mazowiecki was already in power. We were still dissidents, but our friends were already diplomats and members of Sejm. And I can go on in detail. So when revolution finally arrived to Czechoslovakia, it was already after Berlin Wall was down. The process of German reunification was on the way. It still took another almost year till October 1990 before it happened. But it was very clear that things were changing, and everybody who was active player in that situation had to conform her own or their own strategies with these facts. So then you can go through day after day situation. Velvet Revolution, we were first a small group of people, then out of sudden it turned into almost national movement. Handshake between Havel and the Reds, then the fact that the government decided to delete 2 articles from the Czechoslovak constitution, election of Václav Havel president, the events of the first half of 1990, and the politics of transition in full swing. Well, I will say one thing. It's so easy when you see the situation from the later perspectives.
Yeah, with the benefit of the hindsight.
To see mistakes, what did you do wrong? But one thing is to be in the situation and to have to make decisions within a day, in hours, within a week, with the perspective of months, let's say between beginning of 1990 and the first elections in June of that year, and so on and so forth.
What was it like for you personally to make this transition when you were a dissident? Still, I mean, yeah, it was still communism, even though things were happening in 1989, and you were, I suppose, still stoking. You were still a stoker, no? I mean, stoking the.
No, I was a stoker in the beginning of the 1980s, and then I was able to get a job in a very bizarre state enterprise. It was not called Meta. It was a Union of Handicapped People. Oh. By the way, it was the father of Mr. Hanzel, then secretary of Václav Havel. William Hanzel was a Slovak historian, and he started this project and was able to employ for mental work a lot of people like me who could do programs for computers. You are working as a home workers on a very low, I would say, level, but I had a good communication with all sorts of enterprises. I was working with hydrologists in stavební geology and so on and so forth. So I had this type of work.
Basically, what my question was, I mean, all of a sudden, out from the shadows, I would say.
I will tell you, in the fall of 1989, I was still employed as a home work there. But certainly I stopped working because I didn't have time for it, maybe already in December of 1989. And in the 1990, I had to quit this job because I was head of international section of Občanské Forum. I was preparing the first...
what was it like to come from this very active life, but still a kind of private person, to come to the forefront, I would say?
Well, it was obviously...
life.
If you were used to be a dissident, you had to develop certain life routines, not to expect too much, knowing that you are not allowed to go anywhere, that you had to meet your foreign friends here, and out of sudden the world got opened. It was a certain absurdities. I remember well, Václav Havel was elected president December 29, and then we had a Sylvester party 2 days later in Smíchov, and Václav Havel wanted to avoid to be invited and to refuse the first foreign visit to the Soviet Union by Gorbachev. So I was organizing the first trip to 2 German states that took place on January 2nd, 1990. I still didn't have a phone, so I was cut off and there were no cell phones. So I used the phone of our neighbor and was calling to Berlin and Bonn and all these places, knowing word protocol only from police contexts.
Not diplomatic.
Exactly. So I started to communicate with chief of diplomatic protocol, Mr. Kotab. And so this first day, 1 day visit to first Berlin and then it was Munich. It was full of all these strange paradoxes, but very important things were on the way. Maybe we are not all aware at that moment. Reunification of Germany. We met Markus Meckel, who was then the last foreign minister of DDR, and I can go on and on. So it was this trip. And then a couple of days later, I was with Ivan Havel on the way to the United States as some sort of envoyees of Civic Forum.
Just for the listeners, Ivan Havel,
the brother of Václav.
And you started preparing the first visit.
We had that, and then I went to Prague and was head of the advance team to prepare the first visit of Václav Havel to the United States. It was in February.
Yeah.
So again, it was our encounter with the world of diplomacy and all of that. We tried to use our arguments as best as we could, but certainly we were not experienced diplomats. So I could go on and on through all bizarre situations we had to encounter, but obviously the major success, the speech of Václav Havel, president, as joint session of the US Congress, when he, I think, outlined the basic framework of the political process, still today very important.
If you were to sum up, what were the 2 main points of Václav Havel's speech at the joint session of Congress in February?
Look, first, I think that it was very clear that we were all finding ourselves in a beginning of a new era, and that our transition is important not only for us, but for our American interlocutors. So he had to explain to them what was going on and what we are expecting from them. Some sort of support, material, political know-how, and so on and so forth. But he said that there is something we can offer you as a compensation. Our experience with totalitarianism and knowledge that has come out of it. I keep saying till today, have we delivered enough? Do we still have something to do? And the second, and maybe more sexy things today is, if you want to help us, he said, help the Soviet Union on its difficult, challenging, but unavailable path to democracy. Soviet Union turned into Russian Federation, I would say, under Putin, turned to old Soviet-style politics, maybe going back to even pre-Soviet times of Tsars and
Imperial Russia.
Well, Russia as an empire, knowing borders, having zones of influence, and now feeling threatened. I now try to read very carefully and in detail all documents related to Helsinki process. Mm-hmm. Around 1975, and even in its culmination, the Paris Charter for New Europe in 1990. There will be 2 anniversaries next year, 50th anniversary of Helsinki Final Act in summer, and then 35th anniversary of the Paris Charter. And I think that if you want to understand our situation today, the questions that were so touchy and powerful in these times are still with us today. So I think that, these years of transition, Charter 77 that started trying to use a Helsinki process and maybe changing communication between 2 superpowers for our benefit, for the cause of human rights, our freedom, not just to be only clients of big patrons be part of the East, the West? This question is still with us. Our transition means return to Europe, integration to all these institutions, both in transatlantic context, NATO or European Union and so on and so forth. It's important, but we are living still in the world. That is not the end of history, beginning of new era, globalization, and I think that in that context, this experience of the past, and I would say a resilience of people. And I think Charter 77 had to bring together people who were able to risk something and to endure certain pressure and to have a vision and some sort of, I would say, really belief in freedom.
What came up to my mind, I mean, when you were talking about the Washington first visit of Václav Havel was, so I suppose it's probably self-evident, but did they take you seriously? I mean, came to Washington, D.C. and all these people at State Department.
I think that they took us very seriously because some sort of enthusiasm is infectious. So they were really feeling that they are part of some sort of liberation movement and that it certainly opened new possibilities for all actors on the US side. I don't want to say that all of them were able to think along the same lines, so departing with the same point of departure as we did, but I think that no doubt a new space for a dialogue appeared. Relationships between Czech Republic, now Czechoslovakia then, and the United States, by definition, always were and are and will be asymmetrical. It's a regime with a small state and maybe postmodern heir of Roman Empire, if you want to find comparison. When I was ambassador to Washington, it is the first thing you are confronted with, that you have all other states represented there. Each of your colleagues, diplomats, ambassadors, they want to have same access to your partners there, and you need to find your own arguments, your own position, your own strength, and also be aware of your weaknesses. So this is, I would say, almost trivial thing for all ambassadors. You are always instructed by your headquarters to say this or that, but then if the other side doesn't take it right, you are made responsible for the failure. So you need to find a way. You are guardian of relationship.
Thank you for listening to this first part of conversation with Martin Palouš, where we explored his years in the Czech dissent movement and the incredible journey of how Czechia emerged as a democracy after 1989. In the next part, we'll shift our focus to Czechia's role in international politics throughout the 1990s and 2000s, how and why the country joined NATO and what that meant for its future. We'll also talk about Martin's time as Czech ambassador in Washington, D.C., his work at the United Nations, where he also represented this country, and why he remains so passionate about supporting Cuban dissidents and the opposition movement. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd really appreciate if you could follow or like the podcast. It helps others discover the show and keeps these stories alive. And if you have any comments, suggestions or ideas for future guests you'd like to hear from, feel free to reach out. It's easy to Google my name or Czechast and you will find some point of contact. I'd love to hear from you. This was the final episode recorded in 2024, and as we step into 2025, I'd like to wish you a year full of discovery, meaningful conversations, and plenty of moments that surprise and inspire you. Just as I hope like the stories we uncover here on Czechast. I'm Vít Pohanka, take care, stay curious, and naslyšenou in 2025.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.